right, let's move into some more of the protective laws with special education. As you can tell, and as you've probably seen, there have been a lot of lawsuits, cases. Parents have been huge in this movement because they're advocating for their children. And you'll see when you become a teacher and you have students in your class who have disabilities, a lot of times the parents are going to be calling you a lot. They're going to be advocating and making sure their child has everything they need. Especially, this is a generalization, it's not true in every case, but I've found personally that a lot of students with autism have parents who are very proactive, and I think it's fantastic. And so be patient with the parents. They love their kids, they're worried about them, they're worried they're not getting the kind of education they need, and they just don't want their kids to miss out. And so as though you may get tired of many calls and messages about, oh, did my student get this assignment in the accommodation? And I mean, this is the right of the parents. They're allowed to do these things, and their advocating has gotten us where we are today. So I must say, this is also from personal experience. If you work in a more low socioeconomic school, you may find that there is less parent involvement. I've found personally, because I worked in an alternative high school for 5 years, that the students had higher levels of negative behavior that we managed and worked with them and created great plans for them. And they're the ones who, at the end of the day, really start grasping onto us because they don't have a lot of parent involvement sometimes. It's not always, but from experience teaching in low socioeconomic schools, we find that sometimes parents are less involved, but doesn't mean they don't love their kids, doesn't mean that they don't care. It's just they don't call as much. That being said, I did find it interesting working in a low socioeconomic school environment that student behavior escalated like crazy right before breaks, long breaks like Christmas and summer and sometimes Thanksgiving break, because some of the kids don't even have food at home. Some of them were in abusive households. Some of them had no running water. I mean, talk about breaking your heart. Working in a low socioeconomic school is the most rewarding thing you could ever do. And it also at times will just break your heart, some of the things that you would see. So keep that in mind with parent involvement as kind of a bonus. I've also had friends who worked in private institutions or very high socioeconomic status schools. A lot of times in those environments, they have a lot higher parent involvement where they call all the time. And I would say as a recommendation for that, just, not make friends, I wouldn't say it that way, but, make an ally. Make sure you respond to their emails, be communicative, set clear expectations on what you're doing in the classroom. Sometimes teachers make a website or a portal for parents so that they know what's going on. There's so many things you can do. But anyways, off the parent discussion, I just think that's a valuable little nugget there for you to have. But let's get back to this here. So there are 3 levels of support, I would call it, set up within the laws of our society for students with special needs. First of all, and we're going to go through these in the coming slides, they can be ADA eligible, then it goes 504 eligible, and then IDEA eligible. So what does that even mean? So ADA stands for the Americans with Disabilities Act, and that occurred in 1990. And this includes the 504, which we'll also talk about. So it's ADA, and then 504 comes underneath that. And if you, after this lecture, still want more information, you can just pause this video and type in the link, or you can email me and ask me for this link as well if you can't get a hold of it for some reason, but it'll give a greater comparison of these laws. So a little bit more about the ADA. This is to protect people with disabilities, and especially in the workplace. So this is pretty much saying that people cannot be disqualified from obtaining a job or a position just because they have some kind of physical impairment, uh, a disability, or anything along those lines, whether it's previous, whether it's current, whether they might have a diagnosis coming. An office or a job may not discriminate against them. And this is huge because if you look back at the history of that article I sent you and you look back at the history, the 80s, 60s, 70s, and 80s were really not that long ago. I know they feel long ago for us because we weren't there then, but it really wasn't that long ago. So people sometimes still have a mentality that just because someone has a disability, that they're not able or capable, that they're feeble-minded, as you will read in your articles. So this is to protect people with disabilities from that kind of discrimination. So with this, there is a section, so that's in the workplace. They also wanted to bring some protection for students still in the school environment, and that is brought under the section 504. So this allows students to receive reasonable accommodations according to whatever they need to get their school job done. So they have schoolwork, they have classwork, they have all kinds of things, and if they need accommodations to finish that, then according to this law, they need to be given those accommodations. These 504 laws do not apply to private schools or those controlled by religious organizations. It only applies to public schools. And also continue to keep in mind that community-based and job training placements is also part of this. That is my area of research. So if you ever have questions about job training and placement and transitioning students from high school to adult life, feel free to strike up a conversation on Zoom on one of our help sessions about that. I would love to talk about it. It's my favorite thing. So, but to give you some more clarity on what a 504 is. So in the school system, if a student does not have an IEP, which means they're not classified as a student with special education according to the law, but the student is showing that they're having difficulty in their classes, that there are a lot of issues, they might go through some psychological testing, and after going through all of those tests that a student with special needs would go through, if they do not qualify, but they do find some sign there that they do need accommodations, then they are given a 504. So I'm going to put it out this way. There's no documents at all. That's just your typical general education student that do not have documents. Then you have the typical student who has a 504, and this just means they don't have an IEP because they haven't qualified for special education services, but they still need accommodations. So no document, 504, and then IEP. IEP means that's the most support that you can get in a school system, and I'll show you what that looks like in a minute. That's for students with special needs. So 504 is right in the middle. And I used to sit in 504 meetings all the time. And basically, at our school, it might be different at some other places. Typically, our guidance counselor took care of the 504s. They made sure that they were written up right. They held yearly meetings with the students to make sure their 504 was accurate, that they were being implemented properly. And this might look like, for example, I had a student who he just had issues focusing in class, and he had registered for some signs of ADHD, but he hadn't qualified for special education. So he received accommodations of, given longer time on his tests. He was given access to fidgets and different things that he needed to stay focused. He was given preferential seating so that he might not be around so many peers. Those are types of accommodations that students with 504s can get. Later on, when we talk about universal design for learning, I'll give you a whole PDF on almost every accommodation and per disability that you can use. That way you can save that document and use that in your future classrooms. This is good for special education, general education, because all students, in my opinion, need accommodations of some sorts. And I say this to say, even those videos I created to kind of help explain things better, that's a level of support. So think about it this way. You monitor your students and you see where they are, and you do whatever it takes strategy wise to help them get where they need to go. You've just got to be attentive to what's going on in your classroom and be able to make those adjustments and accommodations, whether you're a special education teacher or a general ed teacher. I think it's incredibly important. All right, let's see here. So you can read a little bit more about 504. I went over a lot of this already. Um, it does remove discrimination for students and also for people in the workplace. Covered a lot of that. Let's move into IDA. This is the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. Started in 1975. Its latest version is in 2004. So it's had a few reiterations, and I believe the last one that you'll see was in 2004. And they just made some minor adjustments to the first one. So this is a federal education law. It is required. Everybody has to do it if it's legal. It's a legal matter. And this is what I always talk to my general education teachers that I worked with in the schools. I always let them know, if a student has an accommodation or something that has been stated that they are supposed to do, like for example, they get longer testing time. That's just one example. If the teachers do not implement that appropriately, it becomes a legal matter. So when I encountered, this is very rare, they're very rare general education teachers like this, but it's out there, where they said to me, I do not have to give this student extended time. It doesn't make sense. I'm not doing it for the other students. I'm not doing it. And I would have to come back and say, I'm sorry, but this is in their IEP, which is under the IDEA mandate. If you do not implement this, it becomes a legal matter. If a parent finds out, if the principal finds out that these things were not implemented correctly, it can become a legal issue. And worst case scenario, a lawsuit. So I do make that very clear to say, all teachers have to be aware of what's in the IEP. When I was a special ed teacher, I created a large, like a binder of for each of my co-teachers and said, okay, here's your class, here's a little binder of the IEPs from your classes. And I highlighted the very important things. I highlighted, here's the legal matters that you have to implement, so that they didn't forget, because they had to read these as well. Otherwise, they were held accountable. Let's see here. So the IDEA, it makes it mandatory. If they qualify for any of the 13 categories of disability, including OHI, specific learning disability, autism, and on, if a student qualifies for that, they are given access to a special education plan called an IEP, Individualized Education Plan. So they have to meet the students' needs. What happens is that as special educators, what they do is that they write up a very long document, and they really make sure that everything the student needs is included. So real quick, I'm going to switch over because it's easier if I show you than if I just keep talking about it. All right, give me a second. Okay. So this is a sample IEP, and I think this is good for everyone to see. You all don't have to do anything with it right now. Only the teachers who are going into special education will have to learn how to write these because that's a huge part of being a special education teacher. So this is an example of what one looks like, and I'll upload this for you so that you have access to this example for your other courses, or if you just want to keep this in mind for later. So every year this happens, and at each meeting, and we'll talk about this more later, we have a whole team of people sitting there. We've got parents, we've got any type of speech pathologist, school counselor, psychologist. We have the person leading the meeting. We have a special education teacher. We have a general ed teacher. And if I haven't mentioned this already, parents and the student can attend. So it's a pretty big group. The special ed teacher writes this whole document, and then the general ed and the special ed teacher just have to make sure it's implemented. So here is the example of an IEP document, and I think it's helpful for you to see this because at the end of the day, you are going to have to look at these because you have to be able to implement the accommodations. So a special ed teacher will go through and write this whole document. As you can see, this one's 10 pages long. They can get up to 12 to 15 pages, that a special ed teacher. So have some sympathy for your special ed co-teachers because not only are they teaching every day and monitoring goals, but they write like a 12 to 13 page paper on every student every year. And they have typically about 20 students on a caseload. So you can imagine that can get pretty crazy. So let's say they said, okay, this student is struggling with math, writing. It gives you some information about their social and emotional status, how they will be in the classroom. It shows you what their general intelligence is like, talks about transition needs. Let's see, it gives the goals that the student has, and here's the thing, you're not in charge as a general ed teacher for implementing these goals and monitoring them, but it's very good and above and beyond for you to take a look at them because if she's having problems with verbal directives regarding basic concepts, then you'll know when you're in class teaching as a general ed teacher, and let's say Candace is in your class in an inclusive classroom, that she doesn't take verbal direction very well. So one, that tells you, hey, I need to set a plan in place even without a special ed teacher, or this could become a behavior issue for me. So I'm going to set up maybe some positive reinforcement for every time she has a positive verbal directive. And not only that, but you're also helping this child reach their goal because remember, it's a team effort between the special ed teacher and the regular ed teacher. For Candace, she's the one that matters. She's very important, so please don't feel so intimidated by an IEP document that you're like, oh, I can't read this whole thing. But if you jump down at least to, I would recommend as a general ed teacher, if it were me, I would go through and just glance over the academic performance, communication status, because that gives you some insight in how you can help that student. And let's say you notice, like we said before, that Candace has a hard time with verbal directives. So you decide to put in positive reinforcement for positive behavior. You can also generalize this to your entire general ed class. So you could set up, and we can talk about this at some point, we probably will in the behavior module. You could set up a group contingency, and you could say, all right, I'm splitting the class in half, this half of the class and this one. While we are working on our math at this point, at the end, as soon as this timer goes off and it's set for 30 minutes, whoever has most of the work done uses positive language and is very respectful as a group gets a point or gets to go to lunch early or whatever motivates them. So right there, you took something that helped her and you generalized it to the whole class because at the end of the day, it's going to help all of them because I guarantee you there will be some general ed students as well who aren't very good with their verbal communication and not talking out at the wrong times or whatever it might be. So I'm off that portion there, but this is very, very important. And I just wanted to make sure you know that these goals are something you should be reading each year. The other part as a general ed teacher that I think is very, very important for you right here. So I'm trying to help you stay out of legal issues with this conversation, because this is what is legally required that this student receive. So not all students, like sometimes you will not have a co-teacher in your classroom, but you will have students with special needs in your classroom, because it just doesn't always work out that way. So you are the one who needs to keep these things in mind and make sure that you are doing what you're supposed to legally. This is a legal matter. So for example, on tests specifically, this is for state assessments and assessments in the classroom. So let's say you're giving a history exam and you just give it to the whole class and you don't look at their IEPs. If mama calls up one day and says, I saw that, I'm going to use Jill again. Jill must be my favorite name today. I'm going to say that Jill, she said that she didn't get her reader. No one paraphrased the assignment for her, the test for her. No one helped her write and scribe for her. She didn't get to use of technology. She also said she didn't get any prompting or cueing from you. That's going to be a bad day because legally, this is what you are required to provide for them at testing time. Word of wisdom, if you are a general ed teacher and you don't have a co-teacher special ed with you, if you know you have a test coming and you know you have Candace in your classroom who needs all of these different things, you could schedule with a special ed teacher and say, hey, I really need you to be in the class today. It's testing day and she needs all these accommodations and I really want to make sure that she gets them. So keep that in mind. I make that very clear because I don't want you to get in trouble in the future. So I'm trying to look out for you. One last thing before we move back to the PowerPoint. On the IEP, it also says least restrictive environment. So the special ed teacher will decide what is the best amount of time that the special ed student spends in resource classrooms versus a general ed classroom with everybody. And so right here for Candace, the special ed teacher said, okay, they're going to go to special education classes, which are resource classes for reading, written language, math, and speech. So she'll be in a pull-out class for those 4. Then it says she will be in a co-teaching classroom for this. That means that she will be in a general education classroom that has to have a special ed teacher and a general ed teacher in the same room. And for her, that is guided reading and some kind of social skill instruction. This is why it's hard for special ed teachers sometimes to try and schedule, because you have to find every student on your caseload and make sure you're everywhere you need to be. So that's why guidance counselors, whoever sets up a schedule, is very important to be your friend so that you can work with them on this. And then finally, regular education right here means the student is in a general ed classroom with only a general ed teacher, but not with a special education teacher present. That means if you're a general ed teacher, you're solo in the room and you have regular ed and a lot of different students with disabilities as well. So for Candace, science, social studies, and related arts, she does not need a co-teacher. Just wanted to clarify what that was. And then this is what special education teachers do as well. For each, so this is resource for reading, resource for writing, resource for math, and guided reading, which is, written right here. The special ed teacher has to say how many minutes per service, how many times a week or daily, and then the start and end date for those services. So I just gave you a brief overview because when I typically teach these special education courses, when I was in these classes myself, it is very hard to wrap our minds around when I'm looking at this PowerPoint, which I'm going to put it back up here now, and I say IEP, you might never have seen an IEP. So I just wanted to give you a overview look of what that document looks like. And it is a legal document that has to be upheld according to IDEA. So hope that makes sense. I just wanted to get that all out there. That's the foundation of where special education came from and why we have to implement it. And like I said, levels of support. ADA, it generally covers the workplace, no discrimination for people with disabilities. 504 is no discrimination for students with disabilities, and they should be given accommodations. And then if they qualify with one of those 13 categories of a disability, specifically autism, OHI, which is including ADHD, SLD, specific language disorder. So there's 13 of them. I'm not going to list them now or it's going to take too long, but that's the level of support that they get. Okay. All right. So this next part, you're going to feel like you are eating an alphabet soup. You will tell that in education in general, there are so many acronyms, but when you get to special education, goodness, it is alphabet soup, and you might be speaking another language if you're listening to someone saying all of these things. Most disabilities and the practices have acronyms. Here are a few of them. There's FAPE, which means Free, Appropriate Public Education. There's LRE, Least Restrictive Environment, and IEP, which we just covered, Individualized Education Plan. So you, by now, should know what IEP is in depth. I kind of gave you a nice overview of what that document looks like and why it's a legal document and that we have to implement it. So let's go into these. First of all, FAPE stands for Free Appropriate Public Education. This was not made available to everyone until the mid-70s, believe it or not. Not everybody had access to a free education. Before these last two lessons, what would your opinion have been? If you had students with disabilities in your class as a general ed teacher, was it more of your opinion that you would rather just have all just general ed students and then have students with disabilities all leave and go work in a seclusion class? Are you more interested in making sure that everybody is in the room, but you want students with special needs at the back table working with somebody and then you work with all the general ed teachers or students? Or do you want them intermixed in your classroom working with a co-teacher to create just a dynamic opportunity where all students are being taught by both teachers intermingled in the class, so you can barely tell who has a disability and who doesn't have a disability? So think about that and be honest with yourself, because there's no, I'm not even going to know because obviously we're not in class together, but think about what that means for you. What will you want your classroom to look like? So this is the least restrictive environment, and this is very, very important because what this does is it tells us how often the students will be in a general ed classroom, how often they will be in inclusive classrooms, resource rooms, and as you can see on this list here. So this will, like I said, be in their IEP document for every student with disabilities. The teacher has to write in verbatim exactly where the student should be, and the parents have to agree on it. The ARC, which is what we call it in Kentucky, which is the IEP meeting, has to agree upon it, and then we have to abide by it for the year. So just a little quick overview here, and then we're going to go more in depth. But the general ed classes, like I said, that just means there are no supports. This is general education only with no co-teacher. They're really they're on their own. Even though they do have an IEP, they're able to be in the general ed classroom. That's our goal. That's where we want to be, but we have to help our students to get there. We don't want to place them there if they're not ready. Inclusion. This means that there is a special ed teacher present and a general ed teacher present, and they're working together to make sure accommodations are met and that everything is taken care of. Number 3 here, resource room. This is when the students are pulled out of their regular classes, and this is a set time of day. And typically resource rooms are for content-related subjects such as reading or math or sometimes just writing specific, social skills specific. If a student has a very strong deficit in one of those areas and they need intensive help in a lot of direct instruction and feedback in a small classroom size, then it's best that they go to the resource classroom. Our goal is to always work them, not to, what I was going to say is don't just leave them in the resource room for years and years. If you have the opportunity to work with students for multiple years, that happens a lot in middle school and high school. Try and have them meet their goals each year. That's what special ed teachers do. We help students meet their goals so that they can work their way up this ladder. Maybe they get so good at math after we reach some goals, they're moved into the inclusive classroom. We don't want to leave them stuck at those higher levels of restrictive environment. We want them at the least restrictive, and the least restrictive is the general ed class. So let me keep moving. So self-contained classroom, that's when students are taught by the special education teachers, and they're only special education students allowed in that classroom. And they're there all day long. They're self-contained. They might leave the classroom for maybe a social skill time or to eat lunch with their peers, but otherwise they're only with a special ed teacher, they're only with special ed students, and they really don't leave that environment for the whole day. Separate school. I would have taught at a considered separate school. I taught in an alternative high school. So these students were not successful in the public school environment, and they had to be removed to a smaller environment. We had close to 200 students and very supportive, individualized help for behavior and academics. So that would be considered separate school. But within our separate school, we did have the least restrictive from the top as well. A residential is when things are very extreme, typically with behavior or mental health issues, and they are hospitalized or in some kind of residential treatment or housing. So really, I just went through, I'm gonna just highlight it real quick. So regular education classroom, everybody is together, no special education teacher, only general ed. And this will be a good refresher. Try and keep this in mind for the quiz, I'm sure. Resource room, just always see that as special ed teacher with a small group of students who have a disability, but they only stay there for maybe 1 or 2 classes, and that's it. This self-contained classroom is for students with disabilities who only have a special ed teacher, and they're there basically the whole day to provide instruction. They don't get to go to the general ed classrooms really at all. And then we talked about special schools, and this is only if they are really needing it, and then the residential facility and hospital setting. So that's the end of our lesson for today. If you have more questions about this and you just want to talk special education, you want to ask questions about the lecture or about maybe last week's quiz, you can come to our Zoom meetings and we can just talk too. You don't have to have a specific question. If you just want to talk about special education, I'm there for that as well. So I look forward to seeing you all on a Zoom session or maybe next week. And once again, email me if you have any questions. Thank you.